thanks to the Bloomington Amateur Radio Club to host this each and every year. This is my 21st year version of this program, and I'll talk about that later on. You got to be careful. You got to know what you're doing when you're out doing storm chasing. But the program here tonight is about storm spotting. You as a volunteer helping the Weather Service, helping us to do our job better. Our mission is protection of life and property. We do that through the issuances of watches and warnings. And your job here as a volunteer SKYWARN storm spotter is to provide information when you can as you have storms come through your area and cause damage. Or perhaps you can send us some great looking pictures of some of the cloud structures I'll talk about here tonight. We should be out of here by 9 o'clock. I've tried to tighten this up a little bit so it doesn't run quite so long and makes it a lot better. But also, you'll find here that as I go through the radar materials in this program here today, that the two pieces of information work very well together. In other words, your sky and your radar work as one. And by being able to interpret the radar better, you'll have a better idea of what's taking place in the sky and vice versa. Now, as I mentioned in many years throughout here, I'm not going to make you a radar expert, and I hope that I don't simplify this, because I was talking with Greg up here earlier today that back in November 2013, and when we had 20-some tornadoes take place across Indiana, the signatures associated with those were very insignificant. And we're still struggling with those types of events yet today, and seeing these small rotation features on radar in squall lines and trying to determine which ones are going to tornado and which ones are not. And we've got research that's been going on not only within our office but surrounding offices here in the Midwest, because we all deal with those types of events that bring small, brief tornadoes, but yet they're ones that, they cause damage, and we want to get better at it. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. And also a little bit about the basics of thunderstorms. The focus is going to be on squall lines and supercells, because those are the types of storms that cause most of our problems here. We'll talk about reporting procedures, storm safety, and then look at the handful of events that occurred in central Indiana last year. Now, as you walked in the door, there was a pamphlet back there that has all the kind of the key elements that I will talk about here tonight. So with regard to reporting information, estimating wind speeds, various other odd items, they're included in this pamphlet. So don't feel like you have to jot these things down. The only thing I want to make reference to in this here on the back side of this pamphlet is there's a section that's called eSpotter. eSpotter as a program is a way that we recognize our spotters who wanted to sign up with us and become part of our database. Well, that kind of disappeared a couple years ago. By the same token, our current website structure that you see today is going to change by the end of this month. And so what you may have gotten used to looking at here over the years, you're going to be struggling to find what you're looking for down the road. And I'm sorry to say that that's going to be the case, but that's supposed to be progress, at least we've been told. All the folks in our office are groaning about that as well. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on, and let's start with just a couple definitions. Severe thunderstorm by our books is a storm which is going to be causing damage as a result of either one, wind speeds that are 58 miles an hour or higher, that likely leads to some kind of damage, tree, power line, whatever, maybe perhaps structural damage, and or hail 1-inch diameter or larger. When conditions appear to be favorable for severe weather to cause damage to take place, that's when we, in concert with the Storm Prediction Center, one arm of the NOAA's Weather Service, we issue a severe thunderstorm watch, or if the conditions appear favorable, a tornado watch. And as storms develop and it looks like they are going to cause damage, or based on a report from you, a SKYWARN spotter, that we have evidence of damage, those are the situations in which we issue a warning. We have a product that we issue every day. It's called the Hazardous Weather Outlook, and it's a product that extends out through 7 days. And any time in that 7-day time frame where we're expecting the possibility of some nasty weather, we'll talk about it. We'll reference the day and what we're expecting on that day. Now, if it's out there at day 6 and 7, we may make no more of a reference that it looks like thunderstorms are possible next Friday. But as next Friday becomes tomorrow or a couple of days out in time, and we've been watching the models every single day, and it's looking each and every day like, this is going to be a severe weather day, we'll get more detail into that hazardous weather outlook with regard to trying to time out what's going to take place, and if we can determine whether it's going to be tornadic storms or perhaps a squall line event. But we'll do the best we can to try to get more detail into that product. Now when we have storms take place out there that don't look like they're going to reach severe levels, or maybe initially they don't look like they're going to reach that, we'll issue what we call a thunderstorm advisory, strong thunderstorm advisory. So that's a scenario in which we're expecting perhaps winds of 30 to 50 miles an hour, just below severe, and perhaps hail to marble size. So we're expecting a pretty good storm, but not one that's going to really cause us some damage, and a little bit more than the average everyday thunder shower as well. So with that out of the way, the importance of storm spotters. And you're important to us from the standpoint that we cannot see down to the ground. Our radar located up by the airport in Indianapolis, that radar beam is gaining altitude with distance. By the time it gets down here, anybody know the altitude of the beam? Yes?
We report up to 2,500 feet.
2,500 feet. So it's about a quarter mile high. So that's up there, pretty good. Actually half a mile, I should say. So it's up there, and again, we can't see what's taking place down here at the ground, and that's what you, the spotter, can provide for us. We can infer, based on what we're seeing taking place on radar, whether it's a rotation or a straight line wind, or a signature that may be indicative of large hail, we can infer that that's going to end up causing severe weather, and that's how most of our warnings are issued. We see something on radar, and it looks like it's going to go bad, and so we put that warning out with the expectation that some kind of damaging weather will soon follow. But again, without those reports, that we can't confirm that in fact has happened, and so then do we decide to issue more warnings for cities downstream, counties downstream? It's kind of hard to make that decision if you don't know what the storm is doing, and again, that's what you, the spotter, is all about. You can help provide that information for us. Now, let's get in a little bit of Doppler radar interpretation. The image on the right-hand side, you've seen this many a time before. We refer to it as the reflectivity. And the reflectivity is a representation of the precipitation intensity, where when you're looking at shades of blues, you're generally looking at either very light precipitation, or perhaps you're looking at cloud structure, not necessarily precipitation. But when you get into the greens, you're getting into light precipitation. Yellow is a little bit heavier precipitation. And by the time you're into reds, it's pretty much a downpour. Also, when you're looking at convection or thunderstorms, when you have red echoes on radar, you usually have thunder embedded within that. So if you've got outdoor activities going on and you're looking at a Weather Service website radar on your phone or a radar app of your choice, and you see the red echoes coming, you can anticipate there is going to be thunder with that, and you should be making plans to clear off the fields. The storm that you see here is the Henryville tornado of 2012. We just passed the 2-year anniversary of that, 3-year anniversary of that just a couple days ago. And the storm itself is what we refer to as a supercell storm. And the look that you see in radar is called the hook echo, is the key feature that storm possesses. It's in the southern part of the storm, and it's this part right down there that has the shape of a hook. And that's the part where the circulation is at, that's the part where the tornado is at. And this circular feature you right here see there is what is referred to as the debris ball, where the storm has launched all kinds of debris from trees and homes into the atmosphere. There are larger targets than our precipitation, and thus they reflect a lot of energy back to the radar. Now the image on the left-hand side is an image of the velocity data that's obtained off our radar. So the radar is applying the Doppler principle, measuring frequency shift associated with the rain droplets that are in motion within the thunderstorm, moving along with the wind. And we use the color scheme such that reds are an indication of motion outbound or away from the radar, and greens are a measure of motion inbound or towards the radar. And we also use the color scheme such that the darker greens and the darker reds represent weaker wind speeds, and as you go into brighter greens and brighter reds, you're going to increasingly strong winds. And in fact, in most cases, there's a scale attached to it. Now this particular one here, I happen to have the scale tied to the reflectivity data and not to the wind itself. But right here, where you have, and actually we've worked our way through a lot of the scale here, and we don't unfortunately have the scale here, but this brown here is an indication of very intense outbound winds that's right next to this bright green or very intense inbound winds. And so we have this very intense rotation right here, this tied within the hook echo, that's producing this large tornado that went through Henryville and several other towns in southern Indiana. Well, let's take a little further look at the velocity data. And when I talk here about the velocity data, you actually have two versions available, either through our website or through various other radar apps that are available out there. So I'm talking about the base velocity in general here, but there's also another version that's called the storm relative velocity. The base velocity is best used for straight line wind, The storm relative velocity is best used for circulations within the storm, because what we do there is the forward motion of the storm is subtracted out, so you have a pure rotational component, or at least a better rotational component available to you to look at. But the interpretation will still be the same as far as the strength of the velocity, whether it be in rotation or straight line wind. Now the image on the left-hand side, that's from the Joplin, Missouri tornado a couple of years back, an EF5 tornado that pretty much wiped out much of Joplin, Missouri. But again, the color concept here, and the radar associated with the Joplin, Missouri tornado would be on the right-hand side, or to the right of the storm itself. So again, this concept of green inbound and red outbound. And what's key here is the broad arrows help identify what we're looking at here. So right here we have these broad yellow arrows indicating outbound and inbound flow. So this is the broad thunderstorm size rotation that's taking place here. And embedded within there you see this orange tied to the white outbound arrow, and this blue or purple tied to the inbounds. Very intense inbound-outbound rotation at the center of the thunderstorm scale rotation. That is what we refer to as the tornado vortex signature, or TVS for short. But an indication of the very intense and tight rotation tied to the tornado that's embedded within this rotating thunderstorm. Now the image on the right-hand side, again, is velocity data. And this is out of our Indianapolis office, and this square here is Marion County. The black circle there is our radar located out there by the airport. And you'll notice as you look at this, you see green on the left side and red on the right side, and there's a reason for that. Again, green measures inbound, red measures outbound, and then you have a dividing line between those two, and it's usually a zone of gray right in the middle here. The winds flow perpendicular to that boundary, and that's the reason these arrows are pointed here. So we've got a southwest wind through the lower portion of the atmosphere. Over here to the right-hand side, there's actually a squall line that has moved through the Indianapolis area and is moving east of us, moving away from us, and that's why the majority of what we see here is painted in shades of red. And down near ground level, darker red, lighter wind speeds, and as we get farther away, we get into higher wind speeds and into brighter colors. In fact, right here, this location right there, we've sampled the radar data, and that's what this line of information that you can't read is. But what that's saying there is it's providing me a measurement of the wind speed, 69 knots, which is about 75 miles an hour, or hurricane force, and it's being measured at an altitude of about 3,000 feet above the ground. And so we know at this location right here, we've got a hurricane force wind at about 3,000 feet above the ground, but what we don't know is whether those winds are making it to the ground and causing damage. And that's where the spotter comes into play. A report from a spotter of either a measurement of a wind speed at their location, or an estimation of the wind speed at that location, or perhaps you've observed some tree or structural damage. Those are all evidence to us that, in fact, at least some of that, if not perhaps all of that strength of the wind, is making it to the ground and is causing damage. Now down over here, this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. You can see this boundary here separating the green inbound and red outbound, and look at how our arrows are pointing. Remember, red is outbound and green is inbound. Arrows are pointing towards each other. Along that portion of the line of storms, there is strong convergence taking place because the air is converging towards that line. In fact, this boundary that separates right through here would be the location of this cloud feature that we call the shelf cloud, which is also the gust front, or gusty winds behind this frontal type boundary tied to the rainfall. This boundary is marching along to the east. So this is something that I'll be pointing out as I go through future slides here. I think that's all I wanted to say with regard to that one. But we'll get into many more examples of these so that when you leave here again, you'll have a fairly good feel of what to be watching for on radar. Now, thunderstorms go through a life cycle. The tri-state tornado was on the ground for some 7 hours. The storm itself was probably in existence for probably more than 8 hours, if not even longer. Most thunderstorm life cycles, the typical thunder shower in the summertime, develop, pop up, do its thing, and die about a half hour. So in the initial stages, as indicated in the column on the left-hand side, you can see an example of what that would look like in the sky. You essentially have an updraft that begins to develop. So you're heating the ground, and the heated ground raises air upwards, it reaches saturation, forming into a cloud, and you can see the example of that. When it reaches mature stage, you have a well-developed updraft that's generating precipitation, and that precipitation being developed aloft at colder altitudes. That cold rain and wind is coming down to the ground, and when the wind reaches ground, it spreads outward in all directions. At the mature stage, that's when you have most of your damage resulting from the storm. But eventually, that updraft will die out, will weaken, and that's the source of energy for this. and the storm becomes downdraft dominant and eventually will die out. And again, the typical life cycle, this is about a half hour's time frame. Now, the typical ingredients we need for storms, and Mother Nature is always trying to balance these ingredients out so everything gets mixed up and is normal. It's the contrast of cold and hot, and wet and dry, or humid and dry. And we see that taking place in association weather systems as they track across the country, pulling warm and humid air upward from the Gulf, and behind the cold front, pulling cool, dry Canadian air down behind it. And that contrast is what creates instability. And in the past we've talked about instability, you liken it to a hot air balloon. When you pump heat in the hot air balloon, it gets warmer, less dense than the surrounding air, and that's what allows it to rise. And the more heat you pump into it, the faster it rises, and the thunderstorm will act in the same way. These frontal boundaries, the warm fronts and the cold front, act like lifting mechanisms. They force the air out ahead of them to rise upward, and as air rises, it cools, condenses into clouds, and with sufficient moisture forms precipitation. So we have an unstable air mass. That's an ingredient necessary for storms, and again, our frontal boundaries can create lift to help create storms. But what takes the severe thunderstorm to the next level is either one, extreme instability, meaning very hot and humid air that's feeding the storm, or two, wind shear. And wind shear, what we're referencing is the changing in wind speed and direction with height. As you watch this video here, in time-lapse of this thunderstorm developing, you can see the rapid upward growth tied to the updraft of the storm. But you can also see some of this spiraling that's taking place with this growth as it's building upward into the atmosphere. That spiraling is the rotation in the updraft that is caused by this variation in the wind speed and direction with height. You can see with the bar on the left-hand side, surface winds out of the southeast becoming southerly, then southwesterly, and then eventually northwesterly at storm top. So this changing wind direction with height and increasing winds with height sets up this horizontal roll in the atmosphere that the thunderstorm's updraft will tilt vertically, and we've got this counterclockwise rotation about a vertical axis. And that's what helps to maintain longevity within these severe storms. Part of that longevity also results from the fact that this increasingly strong wind, what it causes to the updraft, it causes it to lean forward with height. In a weak, sheared environment where the winds aloft are fairly weak, just like the surface winds, updrafts tend to stand more vertically, and when they generate precipitation, it falls right back into the updraft, cools it off, and essentially kills it. But in the case of an increasingly strong wind with height, that allows that updraft to tilt forward with height, so when it generates precipitation, it falls away from the updraft. So that allows the updraft to keep on feeding the storm at the same time that it's producing its downdrafting wind as well. Now we see all different types of storms out here, from the popcorn single type thunderstorm of our summertime, but our focus is going to be on the bottom two, the supercell thunderstorm and the squall line thunderstorm. So this is the squall line. We'll start with that one first off. And you can see the radar image on the bottom screen there. A long line of storms from Kentucky down to the Gulf Coast. And you'll see near the leading edge of that line of storms is the narrow red band, the intense echoes, the most intense precipitation that's embedded within the squall lines. That's a fairly typical scenario that you'll have your most intense rainfall and typically your most intense wind coming near the lead edge of the line of storms as it's marching along. Now, as you look closely throughout the course of that line, you can see that there are some segments of the line that accelerate out ahead of the others and start to take on a curved or bow-shaped configuration. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But let's back up a little bit and take a look at the image on the top, because that's kind of like a sideways view, looking from south to north if we were to take a slice through that. So here we have a different example, and this is one of the first examples of the shelf cloud that I'm going to show you here today. So at this ball field here, you can see this bright white cloud and the very dark sky underneath and behind it. This is the lower edge of what we refer to as the shelf cloud. So again, back to the previous slide, again, this lowered cloud out in front, this forcing air to rise. There we have it in this ball field example here. So that's your shelf cloud. This is the top edge of the shelf cloud right there. You can see it there. So it's kind of standing out relative to the rest of this. And you've all seen this many a time in various looks, sometimes looking pretty ominous, other times not so. This bluish-gray look to the sky behind it is the very heavy rainfall that usually follows right after the passage of this shelf cloud. So as it moves overhead, you'll experience a shift in winds. That winds were either light or blowing towards this to now moderate to extreme winds that are blowing out and away from the storm itself. And you can see here there's lightning that's embedded within it. There's typically a lot of lightning. It's tied with the rain that's associated with that squall line as it's marching on through. So that's another consideration that you have to keep in mind. Also, by the way, as I continue to move through this here, if you have any questions over one of the slides I'm showing here, make sure that you ask if you've got something that you're not following. The image on the bottom, again, you can see the squall line. The most intense echoes are out at the lead edge, and you can see how the winds kind of spread outward as it's marching along. We kind of refer to this as worst is first, meaning the most intense echoes are at the outset of the line of storms. Now, in this next line here, the video on the bottom, you can see a lot of lightning taking place within and behind that shelf cloud. So again, lightning is a concern for you in addition to the wind. The wind being straight line in character for the most part, but we also have concerns about tornadoes embedded in these as well. We'll talk about that as we move forward. So again, be concerned about the wind. Again, this smooth bluish gray sky, the very heavy rain down on the ground. So again, you've seen this many a time now. You know what the meteorologists talk about or refer to when we're talking shelf cloud. The image on the upper left, again, you can see the same thing. Again, a low-hanging cloud running parallel to the ground. It looks like it's nearly running from horizon to horizon, and the smooth bluish-gray sky behind it, the very heavy rain that will follow. The image on the upper right was from here in the Bloomington area a couple years back. And notice the finger-like, claw-like structure at the lead edge here. Again, what's taking place here is you've got this rain-cooled wedge of air that's pushing along, forcing the air out in front of it to rise. And so each one of these fingers are a depiction of rising air motion. At times can be misinterpreted, reported into police dispatch as funnel clouds or tornadoes, but that's not what those are. They are certainly an indicator of rising motion, but you're always looking for rotation.
Do they end up like rotating around each other or still have rotation?
There's always that possibility, because anytime you have a strong thrust of wind that's taking place, you can create turbulence and small eddies within a line structure. But your rotation that becomes tornadic is going to be a violent, strong rotation. And you likely would not experience that based on the description you provided there. Now, in this example, watch the video on the upper left. You can see again the shelf cloud approaching the storm spotters. You're seeing the darker clouds are the underside behind the lead edge of the shelf cloud. And then way off in the distance, you can see the rain that's about to follow after its passage. In this case here, in fact, the rain was somewhat delayed, a few minutes behind the lead edge shelf cloud and wind shift. And the same is taking place on that video on the right-hand side, the time-lapse of the radar. You'll notice that you have this cluster of storms that kind of formed here in Bloomington and Seymour Way and marched down southeast into Kentucky. But this line is a line of interest right here. This thin blue line here, and it shows up best right here, is the shelf cloud or outflow of rain-cooled winds from this cluster of storms. Now this is a scenario in which that shelf cloud advanced well out ahead of the rainfall area. So not in all cases will you have shelf cloud pass, boom, minutes later here's the rain. Sometimes the rain may be delayed by several minutes to tens of minutes too. In some cases that rain might have advanced so far along, this thunderstorm itself has died out, so you experience a shelf cloud and wind shift but no rain whatsoever. This is the scenario that happened at the State Fairgrounds a couple years ago. Shelf cloud miles in advance of the heavy rainfall. And the focus was on the red blob on radar where all the intense rainfall was at, and not on the shelf cloud out ahead of it, which produced the 60-mile-an-hour winds that took down the structure, and we know the rest of the story there. So that's your shelf cloud. Now here's where we tie the two together. Yes?
What was that shelf cloud moving with the storm? Just moving across it instead?
Are you referring to the previous slide? So let's go back to that. So say that again?
So your squall line is running at a vertical angle like this, but the shelf cloud is moving across.
Well, with the shelf cloud, what's happening is you have this downburst and it kind of goes out in all directions. So that's why you see some of it kind of pushing due south and it's moving away from the southeastbound stuff. The actual portion that's outflowing southeast out ahead of it, it's actually, the rain is keeping up with it itself, and that's why you don't see so much that portion of it getting far out ahead, because it's moving about the same speed as the rain. But the southbound one is actually kind of moving away from the rain, and that's why you see the greater separation taking place there. Now here's where we're tying sky and radar together. This was a squall line that was marching through central Indiana. On the far right, that black circle, that's our radar, so you can see these storms are approaching the Indianapolis area. And you can see, once again, worst is first, the most intense echoes at the lead edge and the reflectivity data. And these pictures that you see here in the sky were provided by storm spotters in Thorntown, which is northwest of Indianapolis, and Tipton, which is north of Indy. What's of importance here is the velocity data you can see here on the left-hand side. And the velocity data identifies for us the exact position of the shelf cloud or wind shift in the atmosphere. And that shelf cloud or wind shift is right along this green boundary right here. So right through there and continuing right up here between the red and the green is the position of the shelf cloud or wind shift, area that's associated with outflow tied to that storm. Now this line that you see right here heading towards the arrow, that's I-65, and right here is the town or the city of Lebanon. And as you can see, those folks there are just about to have this shelf cloud and wind shift line pass through with probably a similar looking sky like they had in Tipton and like they had in Thorntown. Now as you take a look at the color variations, because this is inbound towards the radar, we're looking at it in shades of green. Looking to the scale on the left, you kind of match up the stronger, the brighter colors with the associated brighter colors on the scale, and it looks like we're somewhere in the 35 to 40 knot range. And unfortunately, we have the scale in knots. I don't know why that is. It's not quite a one-to-one correspondence. 40 knots is more like, and I don't remember the exact cutoff, but 40 knots is probably about 47 miles an hour or something like that. But it's close enough. So in other words, this was a non-severe wind event. 50 knots is equal to 58 miles an hour. That's our low-end cutoff for severe thunderstorm warnings. But an example of how you tie your sky and you tie your radar together. Again, folks here in Lebanon would be experiencing a sky similar to this. Thorntown is actually just to the northwest, just underneath that red arrow. And that's what their sky looked like when it went through the Thorntown area. Now, when we have these straight line winds, we also at times will call them downbursts because it's a downward and an outward burst of wind at the base of the thunderstorm cloud, straight line in character. But as you can see by this example, if the storm were not moving at all, it literally would spread in all directions, just kind of like throwing a rock out in a pond and the waves that circle out and away from that point where it hit the water. You would see the same thing with the atmosphere and the thunderstorm. But because our storms are in motion, you'll still have the spreading taking place, but you also have this forward component that's always going to be lining up out in front of that. And microburst versus macroburst is simply a difference in scale. Small area being impacted versus large area being impacted. Now here's an example of a downburst event that occurred near Martinsville a couple of years back. We had a storm that developed in southern Morgan County, moved up and across Martinsville and beyond. The black arrow represents direction of motion. And right now the most intense portion of the storm is north of Martinsville. And we can see that in two different ways here. One, the most intense echoes right here into the shades of pink, perhaps even a little bit of small hail embedded within that. But on the right-hand side, we can also see within the wind field that our brightest green elements inbound towards our radar are located tied with this echo right here. And so these two are providing a scenario much like this here, except the fact that the storm is in motion. Now again, you match the color over here with the color scale on the left, and we're down here somewhere in the 40 to 50 knot range with the winds that are tied to this downburst that's taking place there north of Martinsville. It was relatively localized, and thus this would be kind of more along the lines of a microburst instead of a macroburst. And this is an example of what's like inside these downbursts. And you've been through this before. The shelf cloud passes overhead, the winds start up, the rain blows hard. And in this case here, we're looking at a pine forest. And pine trees, generally once you get up 60, 70 miles an hour, you're going to start to snap off trees like you see taking place in that video there. Now here we have an example of a microburst, a small-scale downburst that occurred in the Oklahoma City area. So as you can see here in the image, the radar is located on the right side of each one of these. You can see the various shades of red echoes and some purples indicating some more intense echoes down here near Norman. And you can see when you look at the inbound velocity, there's some fairly bright greens that are in here. This storm produced, as you can see by the information on the right, some 70 to 80 mile an hour gusts and some golf ball size hail. Here we have a video that's associated with this event here. So this video was shot in the Norman area. And take a look at your clouds here. The rain has already started, so the lead edge of the shelf cloud has already come through. But in just a moment here, it's going to really hit the wall. And you'll see a wall of rain go from right to left, and you'll see the trees go into serious motion. You can see the hail is already falling. And so there you can see the core of the downburst finally hit that area. So you went from decent to probably non-severe wind and hail, as you saw there, almost golf ball size, to winds in excess of 70 miles an hour. And you can see it trip down that person's fence there. And I believe this is at somebody's house. It sounds like it's at the dentist office, doesn't it? Suck it in your mouth there. Now here's a slow motion version of that here. And it just helps to visualize. Again, you'll see from right to left in just a moment here, this wall of rain, there it is, moving across. And this is where it just really slammed at its hardest. And you can see once again how the trees are bending with that very heavy rain and very strong wind. So there's an example of a microburst. Now when your squall lines, and I mentioned this at the outset when we saw that line of storms from Kentucky to the Gulf Coast, when a portion of that line begins to bow out, and by bow we're talking in the shape of a bow and arrow, when that takes place, that's an indication of an acceleration of winds at the apex of the bow, or that location where you place the arrow on the bow. So at the peak of the bow is where you tend to find your strongest winds. A simple look to the velocity data will tell you exactly where those strongest winds are at. And you can see by the velocity data on the right-hand side, winds were upwards of 80 and 90 knots. Now this was out of the Central Illinois radar. You can see the state line right here. And so we're looking at winds 80 to 90 knots, or winds approaching 100 miles an hour. But we're up there a good 5,000 to 7,000 feet above ground level. And again, this ties back to the storm spotter. Are those winds reaching the ground or not? In more cases than not, when we have a bow echo develop, that's usually as this line of storms is evolving, is pulling wind into it and usually is coming down and reaching the ground. So in most cases, when a bow has developed, a fair portion, if not all, the strength of the wind that you're observing based on the radar, it's also making it down to the ground. Now, when this strong thrust of wind occurs, you also develop eddies on either side of it. And typically the eddy that's on the north side is spinning in a counterclockwise fashion, and this becomes what we call the bookend vortex, but also an area that is conducive for tornado development. In fact, we've seen through observation by looking at the radar data that anywhere from where the arrow is northward to the bookend vortex is a zone for possible counterclockwise circulations or small velocity couples to develop that can create tornadoes, and we'll look at that in just a moment here. This is an example of what one of these squall line tornadoes may look like. Very small, very brief in duration, oftentimes embedded in rainfall, and thus very hard to see if you're not at the right place at the right moment in time. More often than not, it's visualized after the fact, the damage that it's caused. Now here we have an example of a very big, couple of big bow echoes that marched over multiple states, causing widespread damage all along the way. And when such types of events take place, we refer to them as derechos. Derecho is simply a long-lived squall line event. And so you can see one big bow that went across the north half of Indiana, a second one across the south half and across Kentucky. Here in the state of Indiana, in addition to the straight line winds that occurred, we also had some 32 tornadoes. That was pretty close to June 1990, where we had our record 37 tornadoes from a single event. So this one was not far off from that. November 2013, we went from moderate to a high risk for severe weather. The concern was squall line tornadoes and supercell tornadoes. And in fact, both of those did occur. Here we've zoomed into the portion of the line that's up in northern Indiana. So the southern end of the bow right here is near Crawfordsville. The northern end is north of Lafayette. So right here is Lafayette, right there is Crawfordsville. But you can see the bow as it moved through there. Now look at the velocity data on the right-hand side. And look at the boundary where the shelf cloud is located, the boundary between the red and the green. And notice we have all those arrows there, and they're pointing to velocity couplets. And you can see at those locations how the greens at those locations are much brighter than the green on either side. There's also an associated matching brighter red that matches up with that bright green. And bright green and bright red right next to each other, inbound and outbound, represents a rotation feature. Each one of those, as you can see, or nearly every one of those produce tornadoes. So this map down in the bottom here represents all the tornado tracks that tied with that bow echo squall line as it marched across that area. You can see track number 7 was quite long. Many of the tracks, 1, 4, 3, 13, 14, and 6, those were all pretty short. But nonetheless, most of those rotational features produce tornadoes. I say most, not all. And this is the issue that we struggle with back at the office, is when we see such events take place and we see these small rotation features develop, it's a question, okay, which of these is going to go tornadic and which is not? More often than not, the stronger ones do. So that helps a little bit. What we also find is a matter of the vertical orientation of these. Early on in their development, it's oftentimes we find that their orientation is such that the low-level circulation is out ahead of the upper-level circulation. But as time goes on, we see those become more vertically oriented. And it's oftentimes when they go vertically oriented from the lower scan of the radar to higher scans, that's usually the time frame in tornadoes. So these are the types of things our forecasters are watching for. Usually in such scenarios with a big squall line, we're going to start out with a big severe thunderstorm warning. Just anticipating there's going to be a lot of wind throughout the entire length of that line of storms. And where we can pinpoint these rotation couplets, then we try to throw smaller embedded tornado warnings within the heart of this bigger severe thunderstorm warning. Here's a zoom in on the Lafayette storm. So here we have the circulation feature, the brighter green inbounds and the brighter red outbounds, and it's right here at the center of rotation. And at that location there, that co-locates with this area in the velocity, or I'm sorry, the reflectivity data. And so you can see I'm right in the heart of those dark red echoes. So that tornado was embedded in very heavy rainfall, so one that was likely not observable, except after the fact with trailers being lifted off the ground and school walls being blown in by that. And as you can see, the couple of tornadoes, actually, Tippecanoe County was hit by 5 tornadoes that day. 2 of them, winds at over 120 miles an hour. So in summary, with regard to the squall line, the shelf cloud is the leading edge cloud feature that you see with that. With the anticipation of strong, straight line, gusty winds following it, by keeping an eyeball on the radar, you have that concern for the possibility of small, brief tornadoes. Usually we'll find that squall line events, low-end events that are tied to a slight risk outlook from this Storm Prediction Center that have probably morphed into a severe thunderstorm warning. In the majority of squall line, bow echo events and those, we don't find a whole lot of tornadoes, maybe 1, maybe 2, but that's usually about it. But when there's a very strong wind field that leads to the likelihood of a lot of small tornadoes like we saw on November of 2013, more often than not, the Storm Prediction Center will be raising themselves up into a moderate or perhaps even a high-risk category, and you can pretty much bet there will be a tornado watch that will be tied to that squall line event as well. So when you see squall lines and you're under a tornado watch, you at least have in the back of your mind that this potential may occur. So any questions with regard to the squall line storms? All right, well, let's continue moving forward then with the supercell thunderstorm. And these are the ones that will produce your really big hail. Golf ball, baseball, and softball size. Your squall lines won't do that. And regarding your tornadoes, squall line tornadoes, for the most part, EF0, EF1, winds under 120 miles an hour. The supercell thunderstorms, you have those too, but they're going to also produce the EF4s and EF5s that destroy homes. You won't find that taking place with your squall line tornado. So these are kind of like the severe storms of all storms. And the key feature you're watching for here is the wall cloud. You can see it right here. It's a cloud base that's below the main cloud base. So as you look at this here, you can see where the main cloud base is. And notice how this section of cloud is below all the rest. It tends to be cylindrical in shape compared to this elongated horizon to horizon shelf cloud. It's formed by inflow and updraft as opposed to downdraft that creates our shelf clouds. So there's different mechanisms at work here. The wall cloud, prior to this producing a tornado, will show rotation. Early on in its life cycle, it's an indication of updraft. If the updraft develops rotation, at first you might see a barely perceptible rotation in the wall cloud, but as it continues to intensify, that wall cloud will rotate faster, and likely in the time frame that it's doing that, or it's very obvious that it's in rotation, it's probably also producing a funnel that is maybe just a step away from becoming a tornado. Now, this diagram here, and we've had these around for many years, so for those who've seen this year in, year out, sorry to keep on repeating this, but these are still remain great examples of what you're watching for in these storms here. So the curly Q arrow is a representation of the rotating updraft that is formed within the supercell. And it's embedded in this increasingly strong wind with height that's changing direction with height. That's what helps set up the rotation. The increase in wind is what helps to tilt this updraft forward with height to allow the rain to fall out in the forward part of the storm, away from the updraft to allow the storm to remain long-lived. The light blue arrow that you see in the forward part of the storm, combination of heavy rain and strong wind, is the big comma head portion of the radar echo. That's your forward flank downdraft. The light blue arrow, forward flank downdraft. You can see how it kind of narrows down to a tail that has a hook. That hook is the result of the counterclockwise circulation that's back in the rear part of the storm. That's where you're going to find your wall cloud and tornado formation associated with the hook. Yes?
The way you're defining there is the wall cloud, is that in there, it's just above where the tornado is shown?
Yes, in this example here, it's not as distinct as this previous example here. I mean, that's showing it way down. And this one here is a little bit more subtle, but this lowering of the cloud base right here is your wall cloud structure.
All right, so in that feature there, you could have the wall cloud without the tornado under it.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes, a tornado is a very rare occurrence. These supercells, only about 1 in 4 end up producing tornadoes. Although 90% of them will cause some kind of damaging weather. So a tornado is really a rare occurrence. The wall cloud is first and foremost an indication of the core of the updraft, where the winds are rising upward. But if the storm develops rotation, eventually that rotation will impart itself into the wall cloud, and you'll see this spin in the atmosphere of the cylindrically lowered cloud base. And again, maybe only 1 in 4 of those will develop the funnel that becomes a tornado.
So if you see that feature of the wall cloud without the tornado, and there may be more than one of those, that makes it more than an average chance that a tornado will occur with that wall cloud. We're saying 1 out of 4. Is that what we just said?
About 25% of supercells will produce a tornado. Most supercells will have this wall cloud structure. Most of these supercells will likely have a wall cloud that shows rotation.
So then the feature of the wall cloud doesn't indicate a 25% chance of a tornado?
It just simply indicates this is the step in the process. You have the storm form, the wall cloud rotate, a funnel develops out of that rotating wall cloud, and eventually it may or may not make it to the ground. There's a lot of things that have to come together just right to make it a tornado producer, but you need to see those things happen within a supercell storm for it to reach that point. And you'll usually see a well-developed hook echo on radar. And as you look to the velocity data, you'll see this well-defined inbound-outbound couplet that will be tied to this wall cloud in the sky.
That's exactly what I want to understand about that.
Okay. So here again, this example of the rotation. You can see the video on the left, the upward kind of barber pole spiraling of the updraft, the flanking line or newly developing storm towers to the rear side, and this change in wind with height that sets up this horizontal roll that gets tilted vertically by the updraft, and now you've got your rotation about the vertical axis, or that yellow curlicue arrow that you have there. Now notice also we've got a second downdraft in this here, that red arrow at the back side of the storm. We call that the rear flank downdraft, and downdrafts create shelf clouds. So in the case of the supercell, out in front of the forward flank downdraft, we're going to have a shelf cloud. That's probably going to be somewhere in the shades of blue echoes out in front of it. And we will also likely form a shelf cloud back in the rear end of the storm that ties into the wall cloud structure. But it'll again act like a shelf cloud. It's going to be elongated, and it's going to have straight line winds that are going to push it along. And we'll show you some examples of that here in just a moment. So here's the supercell. So you've got this vertically developed cylinder of a storm that's in rotation. We take a slice through it and then take a look at it from the top down, and that's what the radar is showing to us. So again, you have your forward flank downdraft, the big portion of the forward parts of the storm, wind and rain coming down to the ground. You can see the frontal boundary drawn as a cold front out in front of it because it's a rain-cooled air mass that's coming down to the ground and spreading outward in all directions as this storm is marching along. Back at the hook echo area, see the black circle on the right, the green circle on the left. That is where your wall cloud will be. You could draw an L there for low pressure. This becomes a miniature low pressure system. We call it a mesocyclone. Meso meaning a small cyclone, or again, simply a miniature low pressure system, thunderstorm in scale, with its own warm fronts and cold fronts. The cold front that runs south out of the mesocyclone center, the wall cloud region, that's the rear flank downdraft shelf cloud, that downward red arrow that's in the back side of the storm. And that's actually more often than not, its initial position is oriented more in the way of east-west. And as this evolves, it kind of swings around to the south side and eventually southeast as this continues to progress from its early stages of development to its what we call the occlusion stage, where it's about to wrap up on itself and kill the tornado that's in progress, allowing a new one to form typically off to the southeast of the current one. But again, this green circle and black circle, representation of the location of the wall cloud, location of where you're going to have rotation. Now here's where we tie sky and radar together. Videographers looking out to their west, and about a mile away, you can see this upward spiraling, cylindrically shaped, lowering of the cloud base. That's your wall cloud in rotation.
Is that real time or what?
This is it. You know what? It's probably sped up just a hair, but not a whole lot. That might very well be in real time as well. The rest of this cloud base that you see around it here represents what we call the entire updraft or the rain-free updraft base. Air rising upward, no rain falling out. But this is the zone of concern, this cylindrically shaped lowered cloud base. You can see the upward motion, you can see the spiraling motion. Now, those videographers that are taking this picture here, relative to the radar image on the right, they're at the center of this X here. They're right in front of the hook portion of the storm. You can see the radar, the black circle to the right. The forward flank downdraft is actually over and beyond to the right of the radar, but we're just looking at the tail portion where the hook is at. Just north of the tail end of the hook, you see this indentation right here. We refer to that as the inflow notch. So you've got strong winds that are flowing in typically from the southeast, whereas over here within the hook, you've got winds that are wrapping around out of the west or perhaps even out of the southwest. So you've got the circulation right here, and that's what this wall cloud is representing. And it's probably off the top of the screen as your rear flank downdraft shelf cloud is probably wrapping close to their position. Now you notice there, being just to the southeast of this feature, they're out of the rain, they've got a great view of what's in the sky, and that big broad white arrow shows the storm tracking northeast. So this rotating wall cloud should end up passing just to the north of their position. But if you're a spotter that's out in your vehicle, out in the open countryside, you always want to make sure you have north, south, east, west axis away from your area. Although the storm is currently moving northeast, They like to go where the most unstable air is, and a lot of times the most unstable air is to the southeast, and so at times some of these things will like to take a turn towards the right. So instead of continuing off to the northeast, they'll start making a turn towards the east and eventually towards the southeast. And so you want to make sure that you always have outs so you can get away from the path of that. Now, one thing I didn't reference back on this slide here is this zone right here, fairly close to the wall cloud, is a zone where you can have large hail. Now, throughout the entire forward flying downdraft, it's not uncommon to see marble size to inch diameter hail that's being tossed throughout the entire storm, because you've got this updraft on the rear side, winds going upwards at 100 miles an hour, creating some pretty big and varying sizes hailstones, and it can throw the smaller ones quite far. But the really big ones, the baseball size to softball size, is kind of like the difference between you trying to throw a tennis ball and you trying to throw a shot put, which is going to go farther, the lighter one. So the same thing, these big hailstones, they don't get very far from the updraft before they fall out. And I say that now is because where you're going to find these big ones fall out is typically in front of the hook, right along the southern edge of the red echo. So as we get into this next video here, this shows exactly what I'm referring to here. These are some golfers, they're at the center of X there, right out in front of the hook, right along the southern edge of the red echoes. Hey, at least they're heading to shelter. And you can see what's happening there. You've got golf ball to baseball size hail that's falling in front of the tornado. And again, they're right along that red boundary out in front of the hook. The hook is a representation of where the tornado is at. And you can see it off there in the distance. So yes, they were making the right move to get going there. Now here we are, we're back to Henryville, and I have this one in here primarily for the view of the sky. So you can see the hook echo on radar. And actually all these pink shaded echoes here, this one was producing softball size hail. So you know, you're talking some huge hailstones that were falling from this storm. Right here you can see the lower cloud base. This is your wall cloud structure right here. And you can see descending from that wall cloud to the ground is the tornado that's embedded within it. This cloud edge that you see right here, this wraps into the front side of the wall cloud. This is that downward arrow, the rear flank downdraft that's created this shelf cloud, and that's the shelf cloud that's wrapping out of the south side of the storm. It's going to swing on by the south side, so there's going to be some straight line wind. In some cases, it might be blowing 60, 70 mile an hour straight line south of where this tornado has got winds in excess of 150 miles an hour. This image was shot on Interstate 65, just a couple miles south of Henryville. Henryville is, I think, it's like 15 miles up the road from Louisville. And this was the perspective on it. And so here are the interstates and the US 31 right here. And so those folks were probably positioned about right there, looking at this signature right there, crossing the highway, as you see there in the form of the tornado. So hopefully you're starting to get the sense of what you're looking for on radar and how it ties to the sky. Yes?
Any record of anybody ever being killed by these large hailstones?
I think there was a case in China some years back where some folks were killed with hail of that size. So not many cases, surprisingly. You would think that there would. Yeah. Now, as supercell storms that form in a very moist environment, they oftentimes transition from what we refer to as the classic supercell to a high precipitation supercell. And these diagrams here outline the differences between the two. And essentially it's a transformation to one in which there's just a lot more moisture in the storm. And you can see it visually by the addition of this precipitation to the left or to the west of the wall cloud structure. So here's your lower cloud base, and here's the extra precipitation. Visually within the sky, here's the differences that we are looking at. So in the classic supercell on the left, single cell storm out there all by itself, passes on through, sunshine comes out, and bright sky you can see behind it. But this lower cloud base right here represents your wall cloud structure. And so this is the feature that you're watching for the evidence of a possible tornado. Notice by contrast, smooth bluish gray down on the ground, all the heavy rainfall that's embedded within the high precipitation supercell. But just like the classic, the lowest cloud base is your wall cloud, and that's where your tornado would develop if you're going to have one. Now this cloud edge in the high HP supercell, this cloud edge right here, what is that? What does it look like? Looks like a shelf cloud. So that's your rear flank downdraft shelf cloud that's wrapped into your wall cloud structure. We're looking westbound down that highway, so that shelf cloud is kind of wrapping directly towards us. So in a matter of moments for these observers here, that's going to pass overhead, and all of a sudden they're going to have wind smacking them in the face, perhaps 40, 50 miles an hour, and probably immediately followed by blinding rain as well. Yes?
On that classic slide there, that second little dark area,
Right here?
like a hail shaft there.
It possibly could be. Greg was making mention here of what is this feature right here? It's a precipitation shaft. Now whether it's hail or whether it's rain, it's hard to say which of those were. If you had a little bit darker background to measure this against, your hail shafts often look white in appearance, whereas the rain shafts typically look more grayish to bluish in appearance. So a different contrasting background might help to pinpoint that. The rain that's on the right-hand side of this, that's the rain in the forward flank downdraft of the storm. Now this is what the high precipitation supercell looks like on radar. It looks a little bit different. The classic supercell, you had a big comma head and a relatively thin comma tail, which was the hook. This one, a very broad comma tail, more kidney bean shaped in appearance overall. That is the reflection of the abundance of rainfall that's embedded within the rear flank downdraft that's wrapping around the storm. But what we find in all cases, there's usually an inflow notch or an indentation along the lead edge of the storm, which represents where the circulation center is at. Now the problem that you run into with these high precipitation supercells is they wrap up the tornadoes. Can anybody see the tornado in this image here? Well, let me give you a clue here. Can you see the transmission towers in here? There's 3 of them visible.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see anything there by the middle one? Let's help you out a little bit. Okay, so right there. So this is the problem that you run into when these high precipitation supercells, which are fairly common here in Indiana. And so from a storm spotter's perspective, the reason why you want to stay several miles away from the core of where this is taking place, because you might get caught up in rain-wrapped event, and you might get caught up in the tornado tied to that. So you want to be cautious with regard to that. Let's make this, I think, the last one here. I know I've got a lot more to show, but we'll do this the last one. We'll take just about a 5-minute break to stretch your legs and use the restrooms, and then we have less than 40 minutes of time to finish out here. But this one here, we've had this one around for years, but it still remains a really great example of the velocity couplet that you find tied with the hook echo in a tornadic supercell storm. So you can see one of the tornadoes that was produced here. Each of these 3 storms here ended up producing tornadoes. So let's separate out the reflectivity from the velocity. And you can see the well-defined supercell on the left-hand side. And here's the hook. And tied with the hook is the red-green couplet, bright in color, indicating strong motion towards, strong motion away from the radar. In this case, Indianapolis up the road to the upper left in this picture here. So you've got this strong inbound, strong outbound, representing this strong counterclockwise circulation, tied with the hook echo, producing a tornado at Camp Atterbury and locations nearby. Heard an interesting story from one of the amateur radio operators from Nashville, or Brown County anyway, and it said that, you know, when I was watching that tornado on that given day, because he was spotting for us, he said, I saw actually multiple funnels take place. And interestingly, upon close inspection of the velocity data, you can literally see what appears to be 2 separate outbound signatures tied with 2 separate inbound signatures that probably tied to the multiple tornadoes that he saw kind of merge together to become one. Interesting, the forward flank downdraft on this one, notice its orientation. Northwest to southeast, different than all the ones I've shown so far. Simply a reflection of what the mid and upper level winds are doing in the storm. They're blowing towards the southeast. So that's why it's oriented in the direction that it is. Most of the other ones I showed you were kind of aligned going from west to east or from southwest to northeast. These storms themselves were also moving towards the southeast. Second circulation to point out right there, you can see bigger and brighter, which indicates a stronger rotation. And then finally this third one here. Now these two on the right-hand side, they're kind of merged together in the reflectivity data, so you kind of lose some of the information that you're looking for. The left-hand one of the two, you can see its hook echo very well defined right here. And downstream from it, there's its forward flank downdraft. The cell to the right here is its forward flank downdraft, but its hook echo is kind of merged in with the forward flank downdraft of the cell off to its left, so you kind of lose that hook echo signature. But no question, you've got a distinct rotation feature there. And so that's something that you want to be watching for. As you're watching the radar data, just any semblance of a C-shaped configuration or a slight horseshoe shape to the look of the radar echo, you start to watch your velocity data and look for the evidence of inbound, outbound, or evidence of some amount of rotation, usually starting out very weak, meaning it's dark in color. But as this continues to intensify, those colors will brighten. The hook will probably become much more pronounced for you. It might become rain wrap, so it might become more kidney bean shaped instead of distinct like you see here. But that increasing brightness is an indication of increasing strength and increasing likelihood that this storm may in fact go tornadic. Each one of these did go tornadic, as I mentioned before. So again, this is our best example here of what you're looking for in the velocity data. That velocity couplet, green and red adjacent to each other, tied to the hook in that portion of the storm that produces the wall cloud and an eventual tornado. So, any questions to this point here before we go ahead and just take a short break? This radar data is available again off of our website, weather.gov/IND, but I've always confessed in the past, ours is not the nicest looking data. There's several other radar sources out there. At least the one thing that's nice about ours is we do have the velocity data there. The thing that we don't have, because we have problems in feeding data nationwide, and a lot of people pulling our data, is we don't have the multiple elevation scans available there. But there are software programs for PCs, and there's also radar apps on your phones that you can obtain the multiple elevation scans of both the reflectivity and the velocity and the storm relative velocity as well. And it's nice to be able to see the higher elevation scans, because the rotations that develop within these supercell storms usually start at some of the higher elevation scans, say the second or third above the lowest one, and then work their way both up and down throughout the depth of the storm over time. So it's a nice way to kind of get the early eyeball on what's taking place in that storm. Now here we have an example. We talked about the HP supercells, and here's another example of one of those. This took place in Tennessee last year. And so as we look at the velocity data on the right-hand side, and right in here you can see the green inbound, red outbound, or the center of circulation just to the east of the town of Gray. And if I match that up with the location over here, it's roughly right in this area here. So once again, you can kind of see that that tornado was embedded within some moderately heavy rainfall. To the right of it, here's your forward flank downdraft, your broader area of heavy rain. Right here is the echo minimum or inflow notch, pointing right to roughly that area here. And here's some semblance of the tail portion of that. Let's go ahead and watch this video here that ties with that. Actually, I've got a couple of videos. So here you're going to see this rain-wrapped tornado go behind the barn from left to right. You'll see it show up a little bit better in just a second. There it is right there. And you can see how all this strong inflow on their side is flowing in towards that tornado. All the trees and how they're bending in that direction there. So there was one perspective on it. Here's another one. You see a power flash there from a power line. But you'll notice here that debris is falling out of the sky, so that's an indication that tornado has done something somewhere. But it's falling. Now watch what happens right here. That's being lofted. So you know there's a tornado very close by to this house here. So it's literally going to cut from one side of the street to the other through this neighborhood here. And you can see the strong left to right flow on the one side of this tornado as it's approaching this guy filming on his front porch. Yeah, dummy. And there goes the tornado.
Look out.
Right through that yard.
Indoors.
And notice how the winds kind of did a reverse direction because they were flowing in, like one gentleman mentioned at the break time, acting like a vacuum cleaner, air being drawn into that circulation center. But an example of a small, brief tornado tied to one of these supercells. But again, they're always descending from this lower cloud-based portion of the storm, and you can see in these different yellow circles the wall cloud structure. That's where it's descending from. But what's key with regard to the wall cloud is somewhere within its life cycle it shows rotation. Early on it's a representation of the updraft, later on it will likely show rotation. As you can see in the video on the top, and in just a moment here, the one on the bottom is going to get started as well. And so here, again, you can see this rotation present in this lower cloud base. All this lighter shading is a cylindrically shaped wall cloud, and it's marching from left to right, west to east. Yes, this one is in time lapse. It's sped up a little bit just to help it make it more easy to see the rotation that's present in that rotating wall cloud. But as it goes off the screen, they switch positions. You can still see the rotation, and notice what's going on right there. So now you've got that tornado forming within this rotating wall cloud. So that's really the key that you're watching for, the development of that wall cloud. I still like this one here because this came from this group here. Or not this group here, but down in Lawrence County. And this was a case in which a spotter was on State Road 37 down by the Monroe-Lawrence County line and observed this in the sky and reported to us in real time with that data as well as the picture that we see on the top here. And the report was of a rotating wall cloud that they were observing out to their west-northwest. And you can see the hook on the radar and the reflectivity. And over here, here's the red outbound and green inbound that ties with this hooking area right here, and the rotating wall cloud that was reported with that. And that was important for this area here because you can see right up the road there is Bloomington, and the storm's heading right at Bloomington. And it provided a little bit of excitement here because the basketball game was going on that night, and the warning came out, IU Notify did its job, and all the students ran out into the streets to look at what was going on.
Yeah.
That's the part of the equation we got to work on. Bob, you here? There you go. Then the image on the bottom came from Bob with regard to this feature as it was coming here into town, and it still remained intact pretty much as it went over and beyond. Yeah. Fortunately, this did not tornado, so it was a good outcome for us from that standpoint. But it provides evidence of the importance of the storm spotter in reporting this information to the Weather Service so that when we look at this on radar, we like to see this picture in our mind of what the sky looks like, and there's that picture of the sky for us. And it helps us to put that visual image in our mind. It helps our model that we have in our mind of how this looks and how it should work, and it helps us in that morning decision process. So we've talked shelf, we've talked wall. And there are key differences. Shelf clouds are formed by downdrafts and outflows. They're an elongated cloud that runs parallel to the ground. By contrast, the wall clouds, more cylindrically shaped, represent an inflow and updraft, and we're watching for rotation for the potential of a tornado to come from them. But prior to reaching tornado stage, you'll have the storm at funnel cloud stage. And here you can see several different examples of well-defined funnel clouds. But not always will these funnel clouds make it to the ground. It really depends on the environment that this storm is forming in and whether it's one that's conducive for tornado development. We have an example of this here out of Rush County a couple years back, it looks like. And you can see the two different pictures of the same funnel cloud over here on the right-hand side. And it came from this storm located right here. And here's Rushville located right here. This was a day in which there was no outlook out by the Storm Prediction Center. There was thunderstorms were a possibility, but severe weather was not anticipated. The local environment from what we had taking place was not suggestive of a tornadic storm either. And from the radar perspective, we did not find any evidence of a green inbound, red outbound couplet that was tied up within this red echo here. And so our thought was that because when such things happen, and this was up in the sky for probably about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, these things start lighting up the dispatch board channels that, hey, I'm seeing a funnel cloud out here, let's get those sirens sounded. And then the calls come into the weather service, hey, we've got a funnel cloud. And the anticipation is, where's our tornado warning? Well, again, this was an environment that we really weren't anticipating this to go to tornadic stage. So we said, well, you know, we don't have evidence on radar. This is really not a day we expect a tornado. So for the moment, we're just going to kind of keep an eye on it. And if we need to, if it looks like it's going to strengthen, we'll go ahead with a warning. And it turned out that we didn't need to. And as it turned out, visibly, it never went beyond this here. It never reached tornado stage. And so in our case, that was a good call with regard to that. So again, it's really back to the environment. Is the environment supportive for a tornado? And a tornado is really a rare event. Now, in the case of classic tornadoes, or prior to one that goes to the HP stage, where you get the wall cloud wrapped up in rain, you can't see anything, a lot of times you'll develop where you have what is called the clear slot. And the clear slot forms behind the rear flank downdraft shelf cloud because it's drawing drier air from aloft down towards the ground as it's creating that shelf cloud. But behind it, it's literally kind of clearing out the skies, much like once a cold front moves through, it kind of clears the skies out as well before the coldness of the air starts to form cumulus clouds once again. And you can kind of see here that behind the rear flank downdraft shelf cloud, the sky, I mean, it's not a clear sky, but it's a brighter looking sky. We oftentimes see this as part of the 1, 2, 3-step process of formation of a tornado. Formation of the wall cloud goes into rotation, funnel begins to form, and about the same time the funnel is forming, this clear slot begins to develop, and the next thing you know, you've got a tornado on the ground causing damage. Here we have a video showing just that very sequence of events here. So as it starts up here, we're going to have a rotating wall cloud that's already got a funnel cloud that's beginning to descend from it. But watch what happens to the sky over here to the left. Rear flank downdraft is working on those clouds. It's beginning to dissipate them. And so what you see remaining is the rear edge of the wall cloud, the base of the wall cloud, and your funnel is beginning to descend to the ground. And we've shown this many years in a row, but it's a great example of the process that's taking place. And it now begins to tornado right there. You can see debris being lifted from the ground. Even though you don't have a cloud connection to the ground, you're lifting debris. It's thus a tornado at that point in time. So once again, here's this elongated straight cloud edge. That's the rear flank downdraft shelf cloud that's cleared out the sky behind it. The wall cloud, which is being fed by the warm and moist air, remains intact, and within it is development of a tornado. So again, at times you can see that take place. Well, let's go back to November 2013, the Bow Echo squall line that hit the Lafayette area with 5 tornadoes. Well, this was the big one that happened out in Illinois, Washington, Illinois to be exact, not far from Peoria. This occurred somewhere about 11-ish, I think, in the morning, maybe a little bit earlier, I don't recall the time. And our tornadoes Lafayette way happened somewhere about 2 o'clock-ish. But nevertheless, you can see this well-developed hook echo right here, a fairly broad hook echo. And here is the associated rotation, red outbound and green inbound. And here's some video cameras that were tied to this event. Show of hand here of folks who went to our seminar, our all-day seminar last year. So these are actually a couple of slides that came out of that. I figured that most folks wouldn't have seen this yet. But this was taken from that program. And these are some security cameras at someone's house that was in the path of this. And you can see a lot of the debris that's flying around out there right now, including the picture on the upper right, which is inside the home. And the tornado's getting closer. Oh, wow. And now the tornado's there.
Oh, God.
And you can see inside and out, everything's breaking loose. So a pretty significant tornado there.
Pretty solid reporter.
That as well. Did a nice job. And here's the one where I talk about when you're observing a tornado, when it's not moving to your right, and it's not moving to your left, and it's growing inside. What does that mean?
Find a place to hide.
Right. So you can see the violent rotation within the tornado there.
He stands on.
And he's still out there. And now you can see a lot of that debris that's flying out of the sky is getting pretty darn close. And he's still out there.
I used to this.
Yeah. But you know what? I mean, that's the problem that we struggle with. It's just human nature, human curiosity. You want to be able to see something that you've never seen before.
Okay.
But once you've seen that and gone through that, you're taking cover at the first issuance of the tornado warning. And this was the outcome from that. This was an EF4 tornado. Those are the ones that destroy houses, and that's exactly what happened here in Washington. And that was the track of the storm from near Peoria all the way up to Chicago. I've had this in here years in a row, but it still remains a great example of a look-alike. That at times you can have features hanging down from the shelf cloud itself that look tornado-like in appearance, and that's exactly what you have happening here. The picture that was taken there was shot in Morristown, Indiana, which is right here, and the photographer was looking southeast out of town. And it looks a lot like a tornado, doesn't it? But it's not. Look where the echoes are. These radar echoes were taken the same time that picture was taken there. But here's where that velocity data is oh so important. That velocity data identifies for us the location of the shelf cloud or the wind shift. And you can see right along here, this is the line where that shelf cloud had passed through and beyond Morristown. And there's no green inbounds to match up with red outbounds, so there's no evidence of rotation anywhere near there. So this is one of these fingers hanging down from the lead edge of the shelf cloud. So again, you're always looking for the evidence of rotation about that feature. If it's down near the ground, it should be lifting debris. The same thing with this one here. From this perspective, you'd think, well, this is a tornado, but looking at it from a different perspective, it's simply a finger along the shelf cloud. So you got to be cautious with what you're seeing out there in the sky, making sure that you've got your guesstimation right as to what's taking place. Those a lot of times will get called into our office as funnel clouds, and we look at it and we look at the radar and we see that's where the outflow boundary is, and we go on about our business and say thank you very much. When we have tornadoes, we rate them based on the amount of damage that they cause. And we use the enhanced Fujita scale, which range from 0 on the low end to 5 on the high end. And you can see by the numbers here, most of our tornadoes are of the weak variety, EF0s, EF1s, with winds for the most part below 100 miles an hour. Yeah, they're going to cause some damage to your house, maybe lift a portion of your roof off, maybe blow your garage door in and pop a wall structure. So yeah, they're going to cause some damage, but they're survivable. Now as you get into the higher scales, they're EF2 through 5, you can see they account for the remaining 14% of all tornadoes, 95% of the fatalities. So these stronger ones, stronger winds, longer lived, longer tracked, more people likely to be in the path, blowing debris harder. You've seen 2x4s go through cars, well, they go through bodies pretty well too. And that's why the numbers are higher. When you get into the highest end of the scale, the EF4s and EF5s, they only account for 2% of all tornadoes, but 70% of the fatalities. So by far, the majority of people who are killed in the strongest of tornadoes, like the Washington tornado, like the Henryville tornado, like Palm Sunday 65, like the super outbreak of 74. So it's imperative as a storm spotter that you're not in harm's way, that you know where you're at in relationship to the storm, you've been watching radar, you've been watching the sky, and you try to stay out of harm's way. Now, if you're observing outside in your vehicle, and it's a squall line that's running from Lake Michigan to the Ohio River, well, you're not going to get out of the path of that. But at least you can orient your car into the face of it, so as it comes on in, it's not likely to rock your car or tip your vehicle over. So with regard to spotting, and again, this idea of passing along information to us to help us out, this is identified in the pamphlet. Identify yourself as a trained spotter. Let us know what you're seeing, when it was occurring, and where it was occurring, so that we can place that on the radar, both in time and in space. And if you're being threatened by the weather at the moment that you can't get the report in right away, then fine. Get to your place of safety, let the worst of the weather get on by you, and then go ahead and make the contact with us. That works for us just as well. And you can see the various list here. It's a pretty long one. We'd like to know what the storm's doing, because again, otherwise we're just guessing. We infer. And many times we're guessing right, but it helps to have the confirming information. There's a lot of different ways by which you can report to us. The webmaster is a great way because you're going to attach pictures, but you can also go to our Facebook page and like us and send us pictures to our Facebook page. If you like to tweet information, there's the hashtags that we are typically monitoring. So hashtag #INWeather, hashtag #INDweather. I think that's included on that pamphlet there, so you don't think you'll have to write that down. You can go to our web page and click on the Submit Report button. That's kind of taking place of the eSpotter program of a couple years ago. The phone still works, and the amateur radio crowd still remains our greatest source of information. Still on the order of nearly half of all the reports are provided by amateur radio operators that serve all of the counties nationwide, really, all weather offices across the country, including ours. And so as watch boxes are issued, they go into a standby mode, and as the storms approach and warnings start to get issued, they go into an active mode and they report to a net control within their county, but then that report gets passed into our office. And as always, we greatly appreciate the report that you all provided and all the support you've provided over the years, because I know that you guys are out there sometimes late at night, like we are, waiting for the storms to finally clear so you can stand down from your net. But again, greatly appreciated. On our website, up near the top, Submit Report link button. When you click on that, it pops up a form. All the information that you want to fill in can be done there. Key thing is down here in the additional details, if you can provide us your location. That's important to us. You have some generals up there. In fact, there's even a location identification right here. So you can say I'm at 8th and Main, or I'm at latitude, longitude, or I'm at 300 east and 400 south, whatever the case may be, but that information helps us to tie with what we see in radar. And what's nice about it, that works in real time for us, but it also works in these spotter talks. So if you've got a great looking shelf cloud, you got a great picture of a wall cloud, as Bob provided to us a couple years back, we go and grab the radar data to tie with that, and we can include that in next year's program so that we don't have to rehash these things over and over and over. So social media is becoming a more important presence for all of us. So through Facebook and through our Twitter account, we're monitoring what's taking place out there. Not only reports from spotters, but John Q. There's a lot of folks out there that are seeing things going on, and they're talking about it through one of those two sources. And so we have keywords set up in our monitoring programs that when any kind of a hazardous weather word like storm or hail or flood or wind or tornado show up in something within a 75-mile radius of Indianapolis, it pops up on our screen, and we've got an idea of where these things are taking place at. And so those tie in addition to the reports that you all are providing to us. With regard to resources, there are a lot of them off our webpage. I'm not saying we're the sole source out there. Use your television folks. They're very good as well. They're very great at real-time weather. When it's going on out there, they will oftentimes break in and do live coverage. A great source of information to be watching for. From our website, when we're expecting a big outbreak like the Henryville, we put a YouTube video up on the top news story of the day so that we narrate what we expect to take place with regard to the storm event and the impacts that might take place. The key on the right-hand side of the map shows all the active products that are currently in place. It might be a warning, it might be a thunderstorm advisory that's listed as a special weather statement. Our hazardous weather outlook, that 7-day planner, is available there. This weather story down here, the thumb on the lower left there, a quick one-stop shop, brief key elements with regard to the weather either that day or maybe the big weather that's coming tomorrow. Thumbnail for the radar located right there. And when you pull up the radar data, again over on the left-hand side is your access to the reflectivity data, velocity data, storm relative velocity data. And great information there. But again, there's better sources out there if you like them besides ours. And if you really like to delve into a lot of the meteorology, the Storm Prediction Center has a lot of great information off of their website. That's where you can find their outlooks, slight, moderate, high risk, and all the extra categories they added here this year for severe weather today. And as it gets closer, we'll get into the details on it a little bit. And the meso-analysis, where you have new data coming in each and every hour with regards to the instability of the atmosphere, the shear of the atmosphere, and whether those conditions are improving the potential for severe weather or severe weather threat is lowering as a result of diminishing numbers with regard to those. So another source for you. Key thing with regard to storm safety is first off awareness. Paying attention to the weather and the forecast. Storms possible today, some may be severe. Should clue you into the possibility of a watch box. And when the watch box comes out, you're watching a little bit more actively. And when the warnings come out, you've already thought about, okay, where's my place? I'm going to go take cover if I need to. Get in, get down, cover up, kind of like stop, drop, and roll. Get inside to the interiors of a sturdy structure, to the lowest floor available, covering your head up with whatever you have available. If it's nothing more than your arms, you're trying to protect your head from that flying debris, which is what most people get injured or killed by.
I think you mentioned bicycle helmets, is a good idea.
Yeah, for young kids and even adults too, bicycle helmets, you're protecting your head from flying debris. If you're in a high risk and you've got a nasty looking storm coming, that would be a great thing to be putting on your head. Okay. Mobile homes, vehicles, not necessarily safe places. You want to find alternate locations, but if you are stuck out on an open road, again, keep in mind that concept of watching the tornado. Is it moving left or moving right? And if it is, you can just stay where you're at and it's probably not going to come your way. But if it's growing in size, now you've got to move. But keep it in mind that most of our tornadoes are about 100 yards wide. You don't have to move very far to get out of the path of that tornado. And as a last resort, lay down on the front seat, hang on for a ride. Night spotting is tough, and for those of you that are amateur radio operators out in the countryside, and you're in a situation like this that's not a tough one, I would certainly encourage, if you don't have a radar app now, that you have one with. It's nice to call back to base and let them tell you where the storm is at on radar. You can kind of see the lightning flash in the sky, but there's nothing like that radar image to tell you exactly what's approaching your location. But those lightning flashes might help to visualize a tornado that's in the sky. The power flashes are an indication of damage that's taking place. The wind, when it gets strong, roars. When the storm approaches, it's a rotating thunderstorm. It's got a very intense low pressure system. You're going to see a dramatic pressure drop, which you said you've got a barometric trace. Have you ever seen that with the storm come through? And when the heavy rain comes, the pressure has an actual rise to it. Your ears will pop in those very intense thunderstorms, those rotating supercells, much like driving up and down hills. Storms also contain lightning. By definition, a thunderstorm is a storm which contains lightning. It's our #2 weather killer. So when you're seeing lightning or you're hearing thunder and you're outside, you're not at a safe location. Getting inside a building that has plumbing or wiring that can carry the lightning's charge to ground is a safe place, or getting inside a vehicle, making sure you're not in contact with the outside surfaces. Also safe from lightning. You also don't want to mess with water. We've had this in here many a year, but it's great examples of what not to do when you've got water over the roadways, because this is our #1 killer. We've actually had a couple of flood fatalities already this year. So those are our first weather-related events outside of snowstorm incidents. So you can oftentimes not tell the condition of the road underneath or whether or not there's even a road there. This was just simply a wash out the mountainous states of the west. They thought they could make it through and they didn't. And instead of being a rescue, they were a recovery. So you just don't mess with water. You find alternate ways to go around that. So we're going to finish out here with just a few events that took place last year, and thus the reason why we don't have a lot of pictures locally, because there just wasn't a lot of weather, which is actually a good thing. But we still, in the end, had 28 tornadoes statewide last year, and our long-term average is 22, so it was an above-average year. excuse me, it was only because of a couple low echo events that we reached those numbers. One that got kind of folks excited up Indianapolis way was this one here, where the storm originated down near the Spencer area. We were not under a risk of any sort by the Storm Prediction Center, but we had this darn storm that just kept growing in strength, started to rotate, and then decided to drop some tornadoes. 3 in all. And we kind of progressed in our strategy on it. We initially put out the thunderstorm advisory, but it continued to strengthen, showed rotation, so then we went into severe thunderstorm warning, and eventually we jumped into tornado warning on this. And so there you can see on the left-hand side, you can see the hook echo with that. And on the right-hand side, right here, is where your rotation center is, which is tied into the little ball right here on the tail end of the hook. And this shot here is actually kind of an interesting one. You're looking southbound at the tornado. Normally, when you're north of the tornado, you're in the heart of all this forward flank downdraft rain, you can't see anything. But these folks at this position, at this moment in time, they're located right at this white crosshair here. So they're actually just out in front of the forward flank downdraft before its arrival. That dark sky that you see here to the west, well, that's the forward flank downdraft that is yet to come in, but will come into that area shortly. So that was a big one for us. And here's another picture tied to it and some video of the tornado itself and the siren sounding, and we had about a 2-mile pathway that was tied to that particular tornado. You know, and it was just a few miles away from us, and no, we couldn't, but part of our problem is we've got a tree line very close to our office that blocks our view for most of the west through northwest sky. But the folks at the airport reported that. I believe the folks up in the airport tower ran down the tower, got to ground level. Since we didn't have much take place locally, this was a big event that impacted northern Indiana. 2 bow echo squall lines on a single day. Excuse me, get a little stuff in my throat here. But the first one started mid-afternoon and out in Iowa and marched into and across northern Illinois during the afternoon and early evening. A second one fired out in southeast Iowa and marched across northern Illinois and northern Indiana. That one coming in the mid to late evening hours. And the diagram on the upper right shows all the reports that came out of it. The dark blues are wind gusts, the light blues are wind damage, and the red dots represent the tornadoes. And so you can see there some 10 tornadoes occurred up across northern Indiana, tied with these bow echo events that occurred last June. And just so that you can recall, given the right conditions in wintertime, 0 degrees is not right conditions for tornadoes. But, you know, we're getting into the 50s next week, so, you know, it could be just around the corner. This event occurred February of last year, so remember we had a horrible cold and snowy January, and things started to moderate towards the tail end of February. And we had this line march through the state. You can see a couple of bows that are on that line there. And embedded within a couple of those bows were a couple of weak EF0 tornadoes. Out in front of that line, temperatures were in the 60s. So very warm and relatively humid for that time of year, tied with a strong wind field, tied with a strong cold front, generated a squall line that developed bows in these small tornadoes. So again, wintertime, normally not a time of year for tornadoes, but the right conditions and it can happen. And this one here caused a lot of excitement down around here as well. This was October of last year. We had the southeast bound low top supercell. You can see the wall cloud in rotation here. And we had a report to that rotating wall cloud, and we saw the rotation on radar as well as the hook. And we put a tornado warning on it that included parts of Monroe County, and thus the sirens were sounded here. But this one briefly tornadoed in the southeast corner of Putnam County, somewhere not too far away from where this picture was taken here, but never did tornado anymore after that. So one that got a lot of people going, but never really amounted to a whole lot. But that was pretty much it for our year. Just not a whole lot that happened. 8 tornadoes in our 39 counties that we serve. So to sum up what we've talked about here tonight, again, your safety is number 1. You want to make sure that you are aware of where that storm is at in relationship to your area. You've been paying attention to the weather, to the watches, to the warnings, to the reports. Your television folks are a great source for that. Of course, you can find that information off of our website as well. But they're spending a lot of time analyzing each and one of the every storms, and they might be looking at the storm down your neck of the woods. Hopefully you've seen here that sky and radar work together. You're looking for that wind shift boundary in the velocity data that ties with your shelf cloud. You can see the strength of the wind as a potential for what's going to come through. In your tornadic storms, you're looking for the hook echo and the reflectivity. Tied with that, the red-green couplet that's in the vicinity of the hook. That's where the location of the wall cloud will be. And if you're watching the wall cloud, whether or not it's going to have rotation. So I believe that's my last slide there. So before we head out the door, any questions?
Yeah, what kind of storm shelter, you guys are kind of the experts, what kind of storm sheltering do you guys have for your offices?
Well, we're fortunate in our office. Our kitchen area has cement floors, walls, and ceiling, and a steel door. It's not often that we get in there, but we had one tornado a couple years ago that came within about a mile of the office, and our folks briefly took cover in there, and as they did so, they called the weather office in northern Indiana to take over our warning responsibility while we were hiding and grabbing some food in the kitchen. Yes?
Do you have a long-term outlook for us?
Question about the spring outlook. Our thoughts are kind of like maybe last year, because we've been so cold here late into the winter that our ground is a bit colder than normal. The Great Lakes have a little bit more ice than normal right now, so we're kind of thinking that it's going to be somewhat of a slow start to the severe weather season, much like last year was, and overall the season was that way. But, you know, just the right conditions on the right day, and you can have a Henryville all over again.
Never know.
Or you can have a Palm Sunday 65. So we always want to be prepared, but right now we're thinking of a slow start.
Do you have any El Niños or anything like that?
Yes, actually, has it been announced yet?
Not that I know
Okay, well, you didn't hear it here first. Yeah, we've been under an El Nino watch forever, since I think like almost summer of last year. We're actually now into an El Nino advisory. The conditions have met the criteria, so it's now considered a weak El Nino at this moment in time. Probably not going to last very long, probably not going to have so much of an impact on our summertime weather. El Ninos and La Ninas are more of an impact on your winter type weather. Preparedness Week, 2 weeks out, March 15th through 21, as referenced before. March 19th, the Thursday, is statewide tornado drill day. Be prepared, listen, act as if it was a real event, and hide underneath your desk or wherever you go. We're going to go and grab a sandwich in our kitchen. And 2 drills, roughly around 10-ish in the morning and 7:30-ish in the evening. And if bad weather comes that day, we postpone it to Friday. And if bad weather comes on Friday also, we're going to just skip it all together. So, again, thanks to the Bloomington Amateur Radio Club for hosting this here tonight, and the hospital to provide us this great facility, and for all of you spending your couple hours here tonight to learn a little bit more about storms. So thanks for coming.